case you are in the correct place. Probably I think we should start as following the schedule. So this is mainly about a new publication which is coming out recently. And you can see here on heritage, conflicts, and peace building. And some of us already got the hardcover, the cover, so you can see the real book. We give a bit background of the project, and then the whole roundtable will start for authors to talk about different chapters and also some reflections from today. So this coming from 2 years ago, Lucas and I, who is the co-editor of the project, we have confronted with a lot of conflicts going around the world. We know that lots of disasters, crises, and also wars just happening in the past 2-3 years. And we think as a heritage scholars, we think it's very essential for us to think about what's the role of us as scholars, especially on humanities and social science, to confront with all of these global crises. And more importantly, precisely for us as heritage scholars, we think about what's the roles of heritage in those conflict and peace building, and that's the central question of this book project. Instead of just creating a very kind of linear, simple answer saying, yes, heritage creates peace building, we are in a position that open the question and think about in a more complex ways. So the question, put in a simple way, is like this. Does heritage really facilitate peace building, or does it create new conflicts and scars, right? Think about what's happening these days. Think about those two wars just in front of us. Or sometimes even worse, it looks sometimes nicer, right? Does heritage mask and legitimize new agendas in the name of peace? Often nation building, geopolitics, international relationship, sort of things. These are the key questions, and it's becoming even more serious when, during the preparation of the project, we know that 2 major conflicts erupted: the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then the other one we see in 2023 and even going. So make us even further to think about the key question that erased this project. So instead of, one of the key aim of the project we thought about is to define what is peace. Instead of creating peace as a norm or morality, we think about peace building as a process. And also looking at what are the specific ways and the conditions of making peace through heritage work. Is it really possible or not? And also the meaning of peace in heritage contexts, as we are in the critical heritage studies. And so now I move to my colleague Lucas to shortly introduce the structure of the book.
Thank you, Yoji, and thank you everyone for coming. So in terms of thinking about what the book is trying to accomplish, as you can see, it's split across 3 parts in which we engage with different discursive threads, I suppose, in how heritage, conflict, and peace building interact. And it's this assumption, or we try to subvert the usual discourse around heritage in the context of conflict, which is kind of this passive victim of conflict, and something that the destruction of which we should lament. And then after everything is said and done, we're going to look at rebuilding the heritage, but we won't really question why heritage needs to be rebuilt, if it needs to be rebuilt at all, and all of that, right? So it's kind of peering through that veil of the work that heritage does in relation to peace, and understanding that really heritage, especially in a post-conflict kind of situation, has a lot to say about what kind of identity is even possible, and what kind of society we want to be in the aftermath of conflict, right? Because heritage helps to guide that identity and creates these kind of markers to situate our journey. And in doing so, our contributors, thank you so much for really taking to task the brief and the idea. And so we have these chapters that deal with a lot of different past conflicts and in a more kind of distant sort of past, such as the Opium Wars, the post-Trianon-Hungary, so First World War and the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and of course even the Wars of Dissolution of former Yugoslavia. And each of these chapters kind of asks this question of how the heritage of conflict exists, right? And what the memorialization of conflict, what does that mean for the society moving forward? And a lot of it has to do with this idea of kind of almost attempting to enshrine a version of victimhood, and which is really different from that mandate of UNESCO, right? This whole idea that, to quote from the preamble, since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. Pardon the gendered language, people in the 40s were silly in some ways. So there is this idea that heritage was meant to be a pathway to peace, and yet somehow we ended up in this place in which we memorialize conflict, we memorialize our own victimhood, instead of thinking about peace moving forward. And that's one of the big questions that the first part of the volume kind of queries. And then we move to the second part, to this idea of how those identities are actually rather, can be much more contested and negotiated, looking at things like in East Asia, and that's the chapter by Hyung-Yu Park and Risu, but also thinking about Cyprus as a place of pretty much a live conflict as well, still due to the occupation of Turkey, and then, but also beyond that, thinking about the Middle East, which was a fascinating chapter on its own, and of course, since things kicked off in October last year, even more so. And then Mehdi Ghafouri has this much more kind of wide-ranging kind of conversation, focusing particularly in Northern Africa, but looking at more largely at the Middle East as well. And then kind of the second part, the final part of the book, kind of then shifts gears as well again. So it's not about victimhood, which was part one. There is a contestation, which is part two. So how do we turn that into actually a pathway for peace? And that's the chapters we have here, looking at things like customary law in Nigeria, Nigeria, customary law, and again Mali as well, the destruction of Timbuktu and how communities have engaged in the reconstruction kind of context and conversation there, and then finally looking at the 9/11 memorial in New York. And those are the contributors we have here with us. Then, of course, we have a wonderful afterword by David Harvey. And those are the lovely folks that will tell you more about their intervention. And it's then really nice that it is the contributors from part three, because that's where the, in some ways, the kind of the future-looking message of the book lies. So over to you.
Thank you, Lucas. Good afternoon, everyone. Our book chapter focuses on reimagining the 9/11 aftermath. I'm also joined here with my co-author, Sharon McIntyre, and our chapter focuses on looking at ways where peace can be possible starting from within, and that can contribute to interpersonal peace, then going towards our community and globally. In our dialogue of us going through and collaborating on this chapter, we first focus heavily on UNESCO MGIEP, which stands for the Mahatma Gandhi Institute for Education and Peace, which is primarily based in India. So many of us know a lot about UNESCO. The MGIEP has done a tremendous amount of work in close to almost 15 plus years. And what they have remarkably done is have a primary focus on youth. So we uncovered some TAGI, which is Talking Across Generation on Education dialogue policy briefs, which discussed about how to prevent and transform violent extremism. And as we know, many times youth are susceptible to becoming radicalized. And how do we involve the youth in all the voices of our world to find a sense of feeling included? After 9/11, there is further discussions and ways how we can reimagine peace. And there's a tremendous amount of new methodologies that incorporate the possibilities of the self. And one of the modalities we mention is autoethnography, which focuses on writing, self, and culture. And most recently, in the last 2 years, transformative autoethnography is a newer approach to looking at how we can analyze our inner conflicts and what we may be able to take from this analysis and how we can further in recognizing the possibilities of peace from within us. When we look at 9/11, sometimes you might think of it as a US-centric perspective, but many people were impacted worldwide around the world. There are over 1,000 memorials in over 20 nations, including here in Ireland. There's a memorial in Kinsale dedicated to the firefighters. More than 1,000 people that were killed during 9/11 have a connection to Ireland. And the hope is by looking into heritage, looking at memorials to find ways to connect to the self and connect to our world. And the hope is, as well, is we can find a way where we can place ourselves in a part of the present, which can connect to the past and the future. So in our dialogue and collaborative autoethnography, we focus on our own experiences. Having gone through 9/11 memorials, I first going to the 9/11 memorial in Canada at Niagara-on-the-Lake, where many Canadians were also impacted. And then later on, going to New York and experiencing the tremendous darkness, but also a sense of hope that emanates from the memorial. And I will hand it off to Sharon, who will focus a bit more on some of these elements. Thank you.
Well, I think what we tried to encompass in the book is to look at youth at a very young age and how heritage and generationally things are passed on and how we can look for a path of hope. And so when we looked at interpersonal developments, how can we look at ourselves and how can we look at making things better? And that's how autoethnography was part of it. We did something called a culturegram, and the culturegram basically tells you, look at, your profession, your age, your background, nationality, and how that plays into how you think about life and what's happened and how it's happened. So for me personally, I was in 9/11, I was in the first tower, and I thought about all the things that have happened, and yes, it is very surreal. It's almost like a movie in my mind as well as everyone else's, right? But I remember after 9/11, a lot of people were really angry. And I thought, okay, I didn't like what happened. It has changed the trajectory of my life. That's why I'm here today. I was in business. I worked in New York. I had just basically graduated college, and I was in New York City. And then a few months later, this whole thing happens, right? Just very quickly, when I went to the World Trade Center to work, everyone said, aren't you afraid the World Trade Center was bombed? And it was Tower 1. And I'm like, nope. For places like Fort Knox, nothing could happen. Who could have known? So after experiencing that, I just realized so many people were so hateful and they were so angry. And it's not that I wasn't angry. It was just that I can't blame the world and I can't blame a whole group of people for the actions of just a few. And so how do we get everyone on that page so that people can forgive and that the people who are from that community don't feel ostracized and feel blamed and maybe fall into radicalization? So that was the focus of what we looked at with our book, trying to heal from within, trying to heal self, trying to look at a very young age or look at youth and look at their resiliency, look at how heritage is generational and how we can combat this hatred that's in the world and look for more positive means of moving forward to the future. And that's it.
Yes. Okay. Yes, so our own chapter in the book, co-authored with Toki Lawton Brown, looked at peace building approaches in indigenous communities. And you know, when you look at the west coast of Africa, for example, there are a lot of conflicts, conflicts that go on between countries, conflicts that go on between different communities. So the question for us was, what are some of the things within our traditional African communities or societies or culture that help in promoting peace and also help with conflict resolution? Because we don't think violence is the way. For generations, people learned to live together, to work together in peace and harmony. So we started identifying some things within within the culture, right, that promote peace. So we took a community in the southern parts of Nigeria, the Bete people. We took that particular community as a case study to look at the ways in which this community, for example, resolves its conflict and how they have lived harmoniously together for generations, right? It's substantially not a very big community. It's a community with probably about 100,000 people, but they've managed to live together without having any land conflicts or things between each other. And so the question for us was, okay, how have they been able to do this? What are some of the ways within the culture when there have been disagreements? How did they manage to resolve their disagreements? And why this was very important to us is when you move maybe a few kilometers further, there are communities that are constantly in conflict with each other. So there might be some things unique here or some approaches that they have used in order for them to live harmoniously and to resolve their conflicts. So in our chapter, we identified 5 things from within this community. The first one is what we call the village arena or square. In the traditional community is Ushokwa. 5 days, every 5 days, the community gathers, right? So they gather, so whatever conflicts, whatever you have, you can bring it before the community. This helps to build consensus. Everybody, there's no one person that has control over the other. There's no king that decrees anything against other people. Whatever is brought to the community is resolved through consensus. So if they could not resolve it, they bring it the next 5 days again, and they keep doing that until they are able to resolve the conflicts. And it's almost like a jury system. So once everything is presented, the community gathered will appoint a jury that will go and deliberate on it and come back with a resolution. And usually that resolution is binding. But if you feel that it's not fair to you, you can bring it back again, and they will continue to discuss that until there's consensus in the community. So that is one aspect of the culture. The second that we talked about is kola nuts, which are symbols that are very important, not just in this community, but across West Africa, right? Kola nuts are symbols of peace. So these are also a key element, and usually when these discussions are held, to resolve them, you break them with a kola nut. So the moment we break that kola nut and we share that kola nut, it means whatever conflicts or whatever disagreements we have with each other, they are resolved. So we can't keep on with that particular issue. So that's a very important symbol from within the culture. Then the next symbol or next practice is the traditional sacred leaves, right? So these traditional sacred leaves are also invoked among the community. So if it's land conflicts and all that, they are placed on the land, and no one is asked to trespass. They are also used as a symbol of blessing, as a symbol of resolution of conflicts as well. And the last two, which we also talked about, the marriage rights. So the marriage rights are a way in which the community comes together. So the two is not just the couple, but it's also the whole community coming together as part of the ceremonies. And then the last part is the New Yam Festival, which is almost like a harvest festival. With this festival, everybody comes together. It's also a time in which the ancestors are celebrated. Sacrifices are made to the ancestors, and the ancestors are called upon to bring peace to the community. But what we also did in our chapter to now use this and apply it toward a conflict. Though I said the people themselves, the Bete people, they live peacefully with each other. However, they have conflicts with another community, right? So we try to apply the same principles to resolving these conflicts. And some of these principles that I've mentioned have actually been used practically to resolve conflicts with this other community. And one of the ways that those conflicts have been resolved is emphasizing intermarriages between the two communities, and that helped a lot. And then also jointly celebrating the New Yam Festival and also invoking these sacred leaves as well. So as we speak, for several years now, there's been peace between the two communities because of the application of these approaches. In the past, they had relied on state actors, right, trying to resolve the conflicts, bringing in the police, the army, the court system, but the conflicts continued. But since they went back to these traditional approaches, the traditional rulers, the chiefs, the kings, meeting together with representatives from the communities. This has actually helped a lot in resolving conflicts here. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I'm last in the line, and for good reasons. I've got doing the epilogue, and I guess there's a bit of reflection on how I ended up being this. I'm David Harvey, by the way, Aarhus University in Denmark. It was in the summer. The book had already been written, and I think Eugene Lucas sent me it in June and said, can you read this and write an epilogue in like 3 weeks or something? And I thought, and I was about to go on holiday, and they said, oh, take it with you, go, you know, and that's right. thanks, yeah. But it was cycling around Norway, and I was thinking, with a massive book, no, heavy. But I did take it on holiday with me as a PDF on a Kindle, and it was an interesting place to read it. You know, people cycling around Norway, very hilly country, one of the wealthiest in the world, very peaceful country, but at the same time, trillions of dollars of sovereign wealth fund bought into pretty well every company on the planet. Massively dependent on a carbon economy. It's over there. Let's not talk about it. Let's talk about it here. I had a friend who was involved in the transport of a very large fracking device that the Norwegians had made for the American market, and his company was tasked to move this gigantic mobile fracking device down to the coast to get it on a ship over to Houston. And they did it at night, but with no labels on it, nothing, completely covered up, because they just did not want Norway. You don't associate Norway with doing horrible things like that, but it makes millions. So it's an interesting place to look at these things from, really. And I guess where I come to reading the book, but also looking around in the world as well, is just the real imperative to think about the relationship of heritage and peace more deeply. It seems very simple to throw out nice phrases from UNESCO about peace of the world and heritage and so on and so forth, but you scratch the surface, and I'd say peace has a massive problem with heritage all the time. But I'd also say heritage has a massive problem with peace, whether it's heritage conflicts, or even everyday stuff about how academics get money through producing projects that tap into certain conflicts, or the commemoration of certain conflicts. I was in the UK during the centenary of the First World War, and the government was throwing lots of money. Let's commemorate this big war and about how we won. And it was a sort of ongoing battle during that time, as a sort of, look, the story's not quite as simple as that. And people are resisting the standard narratives about celebrating battles and so on and so forth. But it takes us, and it takes practitioners, heritage practitioners, on the ground to try and think about those relationships much more deeply than they are. As I said, UNESCO, lots of nice words, but UNESCO itself has conflict and colonialism completely baked into it, its history, and at the moment seems to be enthralled by authoritarian regimes. That's the phrase I use in my epilogue, as UNESCO's gone totally FIFA, in a sense that where they're holding their annual meetings and so on. It was in Kazan in Russia, but then then got moved. Before that, the year before, it was in China, in Azerbaijan, in Bahrain, in Qatar, back in Russia again. That's all in the last decade. And Lynn Meskel read a really nice paper about the St. Petersburg meeting in Russia, where the hosting of that event in St. Petersburg cost more than the entire annual budget of the UNESCO World Heritage Committee. And so, regimes, come and sit with us. I'm going to ask you a question. Anyone know where the meeting's going to be next month? India, New Delhi, India. Becca was right. Yeah, exactly. You call yourself heritage practitioners? New Delhi in July, just around the same time as the general election results are coming out. Do you think Narendra Modi just might sort of weaponize heritage and weaponize this meeting to say something? It's just, I sometimes get very depressed the way heritage gets involved and tasked within these sort of negative peace, soft power maneuvers deployed to really unsavory ways. So I think it's absolutely vital that we hear these papers and we have these discussions today, and it was really nice to hear these papers. And it's lots of different scales, personal reflections on 9/11, or hearing different community perceptions about peace and reconciliation, and with Nigeria, for instance. And I ended up wrote down a couple of notes, and it was really interesting listening to Professor Azuma's paper earlier. Hopefully I chime with that sort of these phrases. Rethinking the nation state, new concepts of identity, new languages of diplomacy, a deeper reflection about ethics, and that includes our own ethics of how we engage with these things as heritage practitioners, heritage academics. I notice in January 2023, UNESCO did do a very quick emergency meeting, and labeled the city centre in Odessa as a World Heritage Site, and then immediately put it on the heritage list in danger site. And at the same time, you think they're labeling the city centre in Odessa as a heritage site, thereby placing thousands of people who live there in mortal danger, because they're just creating a target for people to go and attack. Where's the ethics in that? People really, we all need to think about these things, not just multinational organisations like UNESCO. And obviously heritage is completely central in this, and so we need a new language of heritage, is what I think there. And so I guess this book is partly starting a conversation and starting to address these sorts of issues. So I'm just going to leave it there. Thank you.
Yep. Oh, appreciate for all the short kind of wrap-up discussion. As a long journey, and as you all notice that we started with this motivated by what happened in the COVID, and then in the process there are 2 wars ongoing. And what happened compared to the previous wars, during Second World War, we have seen more civilians has been attacked directly. There's a failure of international regulations and rules, and also test what is a new form of heritage has been created, as you just mentioned. And it's really about the future, talking about in 50 years later, when we think about this project again, what some form of memorial means to us when we commemorate the civilians during these days. These are all important questions. And also another part of self-reflection for these projects is also based on my personal research interests, which I found is quite interesting doing the reading all the chapters and with Lucas together. That one of the key issues for me to think about is the idea of scale. And we see peace in different way, We see peace often in international and transnational format, but we also sometimes we also care about local, personal, everyday life of peace. So what actually peace means? Today, this morning, Kino is talking about conflicts and struggle happening, or is happening in the part of the process. I believe peace is also have that kind of similar meanings. Conflicts need to be existed. However, reflecting my own research, I found, for instance, my work on China, there are different scales, have a different implication and consequence on peace building. For instance, here's one of the research on Nanjing Massacre. There's a huge national remembering around the country talking about looking at the particular war and particular sufferings of those victims. But how the nations is using that commemoration to create a hatred and to create a binary between you and me, we and they, those soldiers, and we are the women, the children, the victimhood, and they are the soldiers, the masculine and the aggressors. And that kind of strategy has been utilized to mask and using peace particularly to mask and legitimize the nation building and also mask what you mentioned about the victimhood diplomacy around Asia Pacific. However, at the same time, I also find another scale. For instance, this is another work I'm working on, issue of comfort women. For instance, that's in different from national scale. There's also local. There are volunteers translocally. They're working together, helping each other, voluntarily to commemorate the peace issues without any issues. But at the same time, they're also working on healing. How can we help those victims? And how can we develop, for instance, textbooks to support education in the university and schools? These are the key issues for us to think about without the kind of the umbrella in the nation building. Again, these are all just simply reflections, and we have a lot of questions we haven't solved, but do hope that these questions and ongoing debates we can considering not only in Europe, not only in Asia, not only in US, but more in different scales that we hope there's a pathway that heritage can do for peace building. And thank you.
And now, over to you. What do you want to ask of editors/contributors to this volume? One of the tensions we could see, even in the discussion just now and the presentation of the different chapters, is how heritage is often, if you think about the relationship between heritage and peace, heritage is often a starting point, or it's a point halfway through the journey, but it's not really the main thing, right? Heritage turns out to be useful in a lot of instances as a point of convergence, but one that immediately needs to then move outward again, right? And that's what we saw in both in the 9/11 memorial case and also in Nigeria, right? These processes that they start from heritage, but they actually go much, much further. So a question for us to think about is whether heritage is a necessary point in this journey to peace, or if it's just one of different useful points we can choose from. And of course, in our role as heritage people, we're committed in many ways, or we're bound to think of heritage as useful because that's our professional identity. Is that something to talk about in therapy? But sure, these conferences are group therapy, so let's do this. Anyway, questions, comments, reflections?
Thank you. Thanks so much for your talk. It's really interesting and can't wait to read the book. Can I ask two questions? They're quite specific. So Sharon, you talked about the culturograms, and I just wondered if you could give more detail around that as a methodology and how it's applied, and would you apply it more widely? And then I wanted to ask for the case in Nigeria, you talked about applying it with sort of into community, and I wondered if you felt like it would be possible for those methods to be applied in other contexts more widely, perhaps in bigger groups, and how that would work. So, thank you.
So as far as the culturegram is a part of research that's called autoethnography, Yehuda and I did a collaborative autoethnography, and it just seems like the two don't go together because auto is self. But we looked at similar experiences that we each had and then collaborated on them. So the culturegram is from Chang et al. And then Yehuda will read off some of the questions that you can ask yourself. And basically, you're looking at self and looking at who you are, because our heritage identity is inextricably tied to what we think, what we believe, and a lot of that has to do with some of the conflict that happens in the world. And so if we start looking inward and trying to figure out who we are as people, or look at youth and have them start identifying who they are, what they believe, we feel like at some point we can look forward to peace because people truly understand who they are and what they believe. So the methodology is part of autoethnography, and it's a series of questions, and it's not limited to the questions that are in here, but it's really understanding self. And I'll let you read some of the questions.
Yes, so thank you, Sharon. With regards to the culturegram, Sharon had mentioned that that could be a possibility of a template that Chang has in her book on autoethnography. So you may see a little categories of putting in your culture, putting in maybe your nationality, parts of your identity, what your hobbies are. Though, for what we also mentioned in our book chapter, we encourage the idea of focusing even more on the arts, taking away that sort of template and thinking about who am I and how does culture and heritage relate to myself and our world. So we're going to share 10 questions to think about when creating a culturegram, whether it can be just from your own creative arts-based background, or if you wanted to follow a template, that could still be possible for reflection. So the first question is, what exactly does a culturegram represent to me? The second question is, how do I identify and connect myself with culture and heritage? The third question is, this is quite a deep one, who exactly am I, and how do I connect with society? And the fourth question, which is, we talked about that interpersonal dynamic of inner peace and conflict transformation, where may I feel disconnected and not at peace? And the fifth question, what parts of my heritage are visible within me, such as my culture, my community, my school, and in physical buildings, such as memorials, monuments, museums, and places of worship? And a follow-up to that question, are these areas inadequate or insufficiently noticeable around me? So when we think about that question, we're thinking also about representation and seeing ourselves visible in our world. And for those that may not see ourselves visible, perhaps in the physical space, do I feel more connected within a digital space rather than a physical space? And for many people, they seek online pathways when they cannot find a sense of inclusion in the physical community. So when we're going through these questions and reflecting, perhaps with the digital space especially, if we are connecting within the digital space, why? And what are those multiple thoughts arising through this dialogue within ourselves? And then the last two questions, which connect to everything that has been shared, do I feel visible and seen? Is my voice being heard? And then finally, in wrapping all of this up, how do I then share about myself visually? So these are some questions that we present and how we can reflect on looking at thinking about designing and creating a culturegram. And this can be shared with students, can be shared in an arts workshop focusing on any type of element, heritage, peace building. And we encourage, especially with transformative ethnography, to go beyond just traditional academic spaces and look into all parts of our world and bring autoethnography to every person to see the importance of the self, journaling, and incorporating the arts for more peace in our world. Thank you.
Since this chapter was written, yes, we've done more work on this. one of the enduring conflicts in West Africa is the boundary conflicts between Nigeria and Cameroon. So there are a lot of commissions on these state actors having a lot of meetings and both in Nigeria and Cameroon trying to resolve. There have been conflicts and wars around that border. And so what we did was we invited one of the Nigerian representatives in the border commission to join us to work on this particular project, how we can again return to the use of traditional approaches. We presented a paper on this in a conference in Romania in April, which we are hoping is going to be published later this year. And the question for us with this is, before the colonial borders, right, before first the German beacons, which is the basis for resolving this conflict, there were these communities that live in this area, and they knew where their boundaries were, and they lived for hundreds of years before the Germans came, and then later on the British and the French. And so asking the communities, you know, going back and said, okay, where did you farm? Where, when you, this particular community, you were farming, where was your boundary? What did you use as the post, as your boundary post? Obviously, it wasn't German beacons, right, that were used. And so going back and having the communities try to resolve this, which is something that is very difficult to do because of the external actors and the external interest. This problem can be more easily solved by the local community. But because of the colonial project where these beacons are put, and then you have these communities divided between two different countries, it becomes the question or issue of national sovereignty, or which country controls what, right? So this is a challenge that we'll continue to face when you are trying to resolve these problems internationally. And so the question for us was, if we really, really want to have peace in these borders, we need to drop the colonial boundaries or the German beacons and try to resolve that problem between the communities themselves. And it's such a serious problem that when they trace some of those beacons, they carry these groups of people, and they said they were Cameroonians, and they said, no, we are not Cameroonians, we are Nigerians, and then they ran back to Nigeria, they became refugees in Nigeria, you know, and it's a big problem. And I think cultural heritage has a place, heritage has a place here, because most times now you find the same people, different countries, the same customs, culture, history, but now they find themselves in two different countries, and you expect them to get a visa to cross over, and they said, hell no, I'm not getting any visa. We were here long before you came. Oh, you've committed an offense by crossing this international border without any visa or any form of papers and all of that. And so that's a challenge that we face when you take this, you try to take this internationally. Yeah.
My name is Dora Merai. I'm from Newcastle University, and I'm really excited about this book. I think it's a very timely and important topic. I'm interested in your definition of peace, because what I can see in Ukraine, for example, that where there is no hope for peace or resolution, so the optimistic scenario doesn't work, still there are heritage processes which help people to cope with the situation, and these are separate from or distinct from those processes which happen at the official level. So in this case, maybe it's making peace with the situation, but it's not the optimistic scenario. So do you address such situations in any chapter of the book where there is an ongoing conflict and no hope? And what kind of heritage processes might happen or work in these cases? And yeah, so which chapter should we look at in this case?
Right. In particular, the Nikos Passamitros chapter, because he looks at Cyprus, which is a live conflict for nearly 50 years now, right? And it is kind of one of those intractable stalemates, and how are we making do with heritage, and the conversation about peace and immovable identities. And it is one in which the heritage still is weaponized, right, to kind of promote a vision of this part has always been Greek, or this part has always been Turkish. So those tensions never really disappear. They're always kind of there, but it kind of reaches, as you pointed out, an unsatisfactory kind of equilibrium, but an equilibrium nonetheless. So that's one way of thinking about it. It's this unresolved stability, and as intellectually unsatisfactory as that is, it's still more realistic and something that we need to confront more than this view of a peace as a total absence of conflict, because that's just not feasible, right? And it's something we should work towards, but it's a goal that is going to remain forever elusive, for better or worse.
That it could be negative peace. It's an intractable conflict. So you're not going to get rid of it, but it's not. It's at an equilibrium, like Lucas said. So it's a negative peace.
The reason we recognize that it's always in the process, and often conflicts consistently exist within the process, and process as a plural, not singular. That's why we raise the issue of scale here, because often, as you said, when you talk about official, it's international and transnational level. And the more upscale we go, the more superficial it will become. And sometimes even danger happens that peace become a mask to legitimize morality and for other agendas. And using the peace for war making, which is happening, right? So the reason we create this framework is helping us, just not saying nicely that we are not claiming propaganda. We are showing reality of ugly truths, and sometimes, but also give hope. The hope, as you mentioned, is in different levels. And sometimes that kind of peacemaking is momentary. It's a temporary procedure. And even often having a person-person scale, for instance, your chapters and other chapters I can see. That's why it's not rather a kind of propaganda, but more a kind of new framework for us to think about that. Yes, there.
Lucky last. No, off you go. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Really exciting. Really excited to read the book, and I also appreciate the provocation of what is heritage, what is to be rebuilt afterwards, what is value, and what is heritage is necessary in peace building. I guess a provocative response to that could be it depends on the every particular case. But that's a bigger conversation. I have a question maybe which overlaps a little bit with yours. Because I'm interested in heritage and accountability and responsibility, but I see from this slide and from the chapters and from the book description that you went for the justice concept instead, and I was wondering if there is anything about accountability and more responsibility of ongoing conflicts and looting and all the kind of weaponizing heritage, if that's part of the book in any way. Thanks so much.
Chapter on Mali engages a lot with that, or the ways in which the conversation about accountability in Mali and the International Criminal Court kind of discourses kind of overlap with that, and then also Miroslav Sadovsky's chapter engages with that conversation a little bit as well. I think it's part 1. Yeah. And the way in which the Trianon Treaty has been used as a tool to kind of, as a lightning rod really, to think about accountability in, but he takes a slightly different thing because it's more the memorialization of the post-conflict rather than the destruction itself, but there is some conversation there. But the Casey Barrett chapter is the one that would get into the conversation the most. So one of the reasons we didn't want to go too far into accountability, and that's more my bias than anything else, is because there's a sense that, or I have a sense that the conversation about accountability tends to crowd out other conversations about the role of heritage in peace building kind of processes. We tend to think that if we can only get to a court, if we can only get accountability and justice, then everything is going to be fine. And it hardly ever is, right? And that's part of our whole conversation in a different field, which is transitional justice, right? Which tends to be very accountability-centric in often counterproductive sort of ways. But it is, nonetheless, of course, a very important thread, and you can see it kind of woven through the volume. It's just something that we chose not to foreground as much because we didn't want it to kind of take over. Does that make sense? Yeah, lucky last. No, we need it for the streaming. Yeah. Thank you for bearing with us. And thank you everyone at home. Hi.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the informative introduction about this new book. I'm also planning to read it. My question is just follow up to the different scales of peace building that you mentioned, like international, national, and local. I wonder this kind, especially I myself deals with the local levels of heritage activism, and I was wondering what's your strategy of especially examining the local scale of peace building, because if you it is very easy to, I think there is a danger or pitfalls of sort of romanticizing the local scale of peace building in general. So I wonder, especially when you contrast with the national or international UNESCO you mentioned. So what would be your strategy of sort of reconstructing these local scales of peace building?
Thank you. Just briefly, thank you very much for this question. Just briefly, I totally agree with you that locality as a method is also a context zone. And just like the term community, it's sometimes too comfortable, too warm, and it legitimizes many things. And we always take that as a comfortable home, but it's not. And it's always also full of conflicts. Back to your question, how I approach or how we different cases looking at local cases often, I find it's interesting, a lot of chapters we talk about locality or local, it's often translocal, which means, and a lot of things happening in local place, but there's a lot of different actors around in the local space, and through relationship building, trust building, and accountability too. And that transitional justice, for instance, that chapter 2, and happening in the local space, but lots of activity and practice is happening through the translocal. So everyone bring different kind of soft skills and resource and knowledge into that kind of local space. Again, it's a public space, it's a contact zone, it's full of contested dynamics, power. We shouldn't take it as a comfortable home, but as methodology, I find it's very useful rather than just talking about more superficial level of peace building that happen in the convention or legal documents, which become more real for us. Thank you.
So thank you everyone for this conversation. I hope it gives you incentives to buy the book. You got 20% off, and the book is out in paperback, which is even cheaper. And thank you, Laura Jane Smith, for making that happen in your series. So anyway, thank you everyone, and look forward to engaging more with you over the next coming days.